We're going to take a look at the rest of the parts of the brain. The other structure that makes up the forebrain besides the cerebrum is the diencephalon. So the prefix di means between and encephalo means brain. So diencephalon literally means between the brain. So the diencephalon is located right in the middle of the brain and consists of two structures, the thalamus and the hypothalamus. We'll take a look at the thalamus first. The thalamus is a relay center, so it's going to have all the incoming sensory information except for the olfactory information. That's the only sense that doesn't go through the thalamus. And then also it's going to have information coming from the cerebellum and the basal nuclei that's going to have sensory information about the muscles and adjusting the motor plan, how to make your muscle movements better the next time you do the movement, and then sending that information over to the motor cortex. So the thalamus is just a big relay center. And it is going to filter out any unimportant sensory information that it decides that you don't need to know about. So for example, if you're studying and there's some road noise outside, well, that's not really that important. If there's some cars going by and as long as there's no big crashes, your thalamus is like, well, we really don't need to pay attention to that. So the thalamus will stop that information from going up to your cerebral cortex where you would even be aware of it. So as you're studying, you just block that information out because of your thalamus. But if the thalamus decides, oh, wait a minute, that information is actually really important, I'm going to let that information go through and then make you aware of that. So for example, maybe a mom has a new baby and the baby starts crying in the middle of the night. Well, thalamus is going to say, well, hey, that's pretty important. Let's send that baby crying noise through to the cerebral cortex, and let's wake mom up and make her aware of that so she gets up and takes care of the baby. Okay, so the thalamus is a relay center, and it's going to filter out any unimportant sensory information and block that out. Because you can imagine if all the sensory information got up to your cerebral cortex and you're aware of everything, it would be pretty overwhelming. So the thalamus is going to decide what's important, what to make you aware of, and then block everything else that's not important. So here's what the thalamus is located. The word thalamus means inner room, and you can see the thalamus is located right here. So it's pretty deep right in the middle of the brain there, kind of right on top of the brainstem. And this is just another picture just showing you how the thalamus is a relay center for sensory information. So here we've got a finger, you pricked it on a rose, and we've got some sensory neurons in your hand, and they're going to be sending information up from the periphery, up through the spinal cord, up the brainstem. And then notice that we're going to synapse here in the thalamus. And the thalamus is going to decide, is that important information? Should you be made aware of that? And it decides, yeah, that's probably pretty important. You should know that you're poking your finger. So it'll go ahead and allow that signal to go through up to the cerebral cortex, and then you're aware that you're poking your finger on a thorn. Okay, and the other structure that makes up the diencephalon besides the thalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is small, but it has a lot of really important functions, so it's a pretty busy place in the brain. The name says where it's located, hypo meaning below, so it's located right below the thalamus, and the two organ systems that it is a part of. So it's going to be part, obviously, of the nervous system because it's part of the brain. And then remember that the hypothalamus also secretes hormones, so it's also part of the endocrine system. And being part of both the nervous system and the endocrine system, it's not surprising that it helps regulate homeostasis, because nervous system and endocrine system, both of them, that's their big job. So the hypothalamic hormones, what two endocrine glands are they going to be controlling? So hopefully you remembered that the hypothalamic hormones are going to go into that portal system, and they will jump off and talk to the anterior pituitary and tell the anterior pituitary gland which hormones to release. And then remember that the hypothalamus, the neurons that start there, will extend down, and then they actually will form the posterior pituitary. So those are the two endocrine glands that they control. The hypothalamus also affects the autonomic nervous system, which we're going to be talking about in chapter 11. But the hypothalamus is involved in some emotions like anger. And when you get angry, for example, your heart rate and blood pressure go up. And that's because the hypothalamus influences the cardiovascular control center in the brainstem and causes your heart rate and blood pressure to go up. So there are some effects on the autonomic nervous system. Hypothalamus also controls your food intake. There are hunger and satiety centers. Satiety just means you're full. So that affects whether you're feeling hungry or full. There's also a thirst center in the hypothalamus. So that'll tell you if you should be getting a drink or not. Thermoregulation is also controlled by the hypothalamus. This is where your body's thermostat is located. And then, as we said, hypothalamus is involved in some emotions that you feel. It is part of the limbic system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then the hypothalamus is also involved in controlling circadian rhythms in the body. There's a group of neurons in the hypothalamus. It's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And they keep track of that 24-hour cycle. So along with the pineal gland, the hypothalamus is involved in controlling your circadian rhythms, which is pretty neat. And this is where the hypothalamus is located. So your thalamus is right here. And then the hypothalamus is located right below the thalamus. And then hanging off this stalk right below that would be your pituitary gland. Okay, our next structure is the limbic system. And the limbic system contains quite a few parts. You do not have to memorize all of these parts. You can look at them, but they're all highlighted in green. And notice that the limbic system forms kind of a ring-like structure here, deep inside the brain. How it got its name, limbic means border in Latin. So that's just kind of, they thought it looked like a border or an edge or a rim, and so that's kind of where it got its name from. The limbic system is involved in a couple of things. It is involved in learning, emotions, and also motivation. It's a very old part of the brain. And as far as learning, the structures that are involved there, you might have heard of the hippocampus. So that's the structure here. And also the amygdala is involved in learning as well. The amygdala will attach emotions to certain memories because you're more likely to remember things if there's a strong emotion attached to it. So for example, a lot of people remember exactly where they were when they first found out about 9/11, for example. because that was such a horrible experience and shocking and a lot of fear and anxiety. And so the amygdala was really stimulated there. The amygdala creates a lot of fear and anxiety. And if you attach that to memories, the hippocampus is more likely to store those memories more strongly, and you're more likely to remember that. Emotions, like we said, hypothalamus is involved. So there are some parts of the hypothalamus here that are involved in the limbic system. And then motivation, we do have a couple things going on here, but one of them, there is a reward and punishment centers that are in the limbic system. The reward centers make you feel good. They reward you for doing something. And punishment centers say, hey, don't do that again. So that'll provide some motivation for why you do some things. And also, unfortunately, the reward centers are involved in drug addiction. Okay, the next part of the brain we have is the cerebellum, and it is off the back here. The word cerebellum literally means little brain because they thought it was a little brain hanging off the big brain. The cerebellum is involved in motor functions, so it's going to help you coordinate your movements and also is involved in your balance. And so it allows you to, for example, walk a straight line without falling over. It also helps smooth and fine-tune your movements. So your movements aren't real jerky, and also like if you're learning to play the guitar, it helps you get better at positioning your fingers to like play the chords. That's all your cerebellum that's doing that. And your cerebellum will also store motor plans. So like, if you haven't ridden a bike in a couple years and you get on the bike, you'll still remember how to ride the bike. And that's because the cerebellum will actually store the motor plans of how to move your muscles and how to position your body. And that all comes from your cerebellum, which is pretty cool. Okay, and last part we're going to talk about is your brainstem. And this has 3 parts. You've got your midbrain, which is closest to the forebrain and the cerebellum, and then the pons, and then the medulla oblongata, which connects into the spinal cord. There's a lot of things going on in the brainstem. You've got 10 of your 12 pairs of cranial nerves that are going in and out of the brainstem. The only 2 cranial nerves that don't go in and out of the brainstem are cranial nerve 1, the olfactory nerve, and cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, which I'm not going to ask you about. We also have a lot of autonomic nervous system control centers in the brainstem. So the cardiovascular control center, controlling your heart rate and blood pressure, that's located in your brainstem. There's a respiratory center here, digestive center here. There's a reticular formation in your brainstem. Reticular means net-like. So you've got this net-like network of neurons that extend throughout the brainstem, and these neurons are responsible for your consciousness. So when you stimulate them, you're conscious and awake. And if you damage the reticular formation, you remain unconscious and you're in a vegetative state in a coma the rest of your life. So the brainstem is a pretty important structure. We also have some motor neurons going in and out of the brainstem. They control the head muscles, so like your eye muscles, chewing, swallowing, those kinds of things. And then also we have some motor neurons going to the muscles that control your trunk muscles and help keep you upright with your body posture. And then this is just a picture of your brainstem. The midbrain sits on top of the brainstem. It's right below the thalamus. And then the pons, the way I remember that is I remember the pons pooches out, okay? And it kind of sticks out there, and it's right across from the cerebellum. And then the medulla oblongata will then join in with the spinal cord.